Welcome to Talk South Asian to Me, Season 2. My name is Michelle.
And my name is Anusha. Tune in every Thursday at 5 p.m. Central and hear us react to each other's stories about mental health and growing up in different South Asian households.
And remember, this podcast is not therapy. Engage with what feels entertaining and resonates with you and leave what doesn't. All right, you ready for letter V?
Let's do it. Topic review V.
Yes, I know. So the topic for this letter in this episode is vulnerability.
Woohoo!
Woohoo!
Let's get vulnerable.
Yes, let's get vulnerable.
Isn't there a song, Let's Get Physical? It's like, I can already hear that in my mind. That's what's playing. Let's get vulnerable.
Let's get vulnerable.
Oh gosh, here we go. We're going to get super
A little
vulnerable.
parody.
So that reminds me of our parody.
Do not bring it up.
We
must not speak about it.
We're not going to talk about it.
Okay, so for my background for today on this topic, the sources that I used was a very well-mined article titled How to Be Vulnerable. It was like updated on November 2023. And then a Berkeley Wellbeing Institute article. It was titled Definitions and Tips from Brene Brown and others. And it was also published in 2024. Okay, so let's start with the definition. The term vulnerable means to be susceptible to physical or emotional harm, or quote unquote at risk. So for today's episode, we're going to mainly focus on emotional vulnerability. So we'll dig into that. So the definition of emotional vulnerability is that a person is susceptible to emotional harm or pain. At the root of it, this harm comes from your emotional experiences, especially the ones that are painful. Being emotionally vulnerable involves the process of acknowledging your emotions, especially those that are uncomfortable or painful. Okay? So let's talk some examples, right? When a person feels vulnerable, it is normal for them to feel self-conscious, anxious, scared. That is all normal. Being vulnerable means that you're taking the time to acknowledge difficult emotions instead of acting on them right away. Okay? But I do want to point out that vulnerability is not the same thing as rumination. You don't want to be obsessed with your uncomfortable feelings. This can be just as harmful as avoiding them.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
So really vulnerability, active or emotional vulnerability is acknowledging, right? Like actively acknowledging your feelings, especially the ones that are painful, that might quote like emotions are not positive or negative, but might be perceived negative by others. Right?
Heavy. I like to say
heavy. There you go. So one of these articles talked about the process of being emotionally vulnerable, and that involves a 2-step process. So the first step to be emotionally vulnerable is observing or becoming aware of your own emotions. I like that word, observing, right? Like you're like observing yourself as like a third party. You're like moving from the outside and looking in. Observing that you are feeling anger, sadness, anxiety without thinking about it or acting on it. Okay, that's the first step. Observation, right? Just observing what you're feeling. And then is validating your own emotions. Telling yourself that it is okay to feel whatever you are feeling, showing no judgment toward yourself. And the second one can be so tricky and hard, I feel like, right? You can be aware and observe how you feel, but that second piece is so important, that you validate yourself. You acknowledge that it's okay to feel whatever you're feeling. There's no judgment.
Like most people who have that like inner critic's voice is kind of like judging
exactly
feeling or shaming you for it or guilting you for it or any number of those heavy emotions we just talked about.
Yes, exactly. So some examples of like concrete examples of emotional vulnerability are, the first one I have is taking chances that might lead to rejection. Talking about mistakes you have made out loud. Sharing personal details that you normally keep private. Feeling difficult emotions such as shame, grief, or fear. Right? You're feeling that and validating those. Reconnecting with someone you have fallen out with or had a fallout with. Being honest about what you need in a relationship, including your own boundaries and expectations, which we've talked about in the past, right? When you are stating your boundaries and expectations, you're vulnerable because you're setting your boundaries. You're giving the other person kind of place to either respect or disrespect your boundaries, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So some benefits to being emotionally vulnerable is that it can ease anxiety, it can strengthen relationships, and it can help one become more self-aware. And if someone wants to actively work towards being more vulnerable or emotionally vulnerable, some ways are acknowledging your emotions by labeling them. For example, a person can say to themselves, I'm feeling a bit stressed. Be concrete and say, I'm feeling angry and hurt. This is towards another person. I'm feeling angry and hurt from the fight I had yesterday with my partner, right? The I statement, labeling those emotions. Imagine you were describing how you were feeling to a child. Another way to help someone be more vulnerable is journaling, and then practicing being assertive and also seeking professional help. Okay. And then I really like this quote that relates to vulnerability. It's by Alaric Hutchinson. And this quote is, vulnerability really means to be strong and secure enough within yourself that you are able to walk outside without your armor on. You are able to show up in life as just you. That is genuine strength and courage. Armor may look tough, but all it does is mask insecurity and fear. I really like that quote. So I was like, I need to share this. Yes. It's helpful to like visualize vulnerability because it's so abstract. So that was my general background for vulnerability. Any thoughts? Anything you would like to add?
No, I feel like that was pretty thorough, as far as
Yeah.
vulnerability goes. I mean, that's really all there is to it.
Yeah.
But I think, the piece that hopefully people can take away is that there is space to be vulnerable, especially if you want meaningful relationships. It's a big part of creating and having and
Right.
maintaining a
Yes.
meaningful relationship is it comes with the territory of practicing mutual vulnerability.
Yeah. And sometimes even before you can have the mutual vulnerability, it's important to do the internal work to be able to be vulnerable, right? Like that's like the big step. I feel like I'll get into that in my story is like becoming an observer of my own emotions, right? Stepping out of them and then labeling them, but then also accepting them, acknowledging them. That can be really
Validating
tricky.
them. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. That's good thoughts. So, ready for adding of the South Asian spice to it?
Yes, add the masala.
Yes.
Ready.
Yes, there you go. So, sitting there typing away all the different phrases I can, and lo and behold, there wasn't much when it comes to vulnerability, but there was some things when it comes to like vulnerability, like stigma, specifically with men, which was interesting. Yeah. So this article I found is from the Sari Collective, and is titled Silent Struggles: Unveiling Mental Health Stigma in South Asian Men. And it was published in March 2024 and written by Gurvinder Kaur. And it's about like lack of vulnerability. So I have a quote from it or excerpt from it. So from an early age, boys are exposed to what being a man is all about, including suppressing vulnerable parts of themselves. In India, often the use of the Hindi phrase "ये क्या रो रहे हैं, लड़के ऐसे रोते नहीं हैं," right? Why are you crying like, or लड़की जैसे, why are you crying like girls? This not only sends a message about gender expectations and norms, it also leaves them having none to little respect for their own or others' vulnerability. So thus translating the message that anyone displaying vulnerability is weak, and so men inherit an inner compass that shames not only themselves, but also anyone around them that is brave enough to be vulnerable. And this was so, like, it wasn't surprising to me, but it was great to like see this right out there, that, and it's so common. Like, I feel like I personally know so many South Asian men that just struggle with vulnerability, that just have a hard time being vulnerable, right? it's hard for them to observe emotions, let alone their own, right? Like others' emotion, their own. It's hard to
Understand.
validate. Yeah. And even validating emotions can be difficult for them.
Absolutely. And
Mhm.
like, I mean, inherently too, in that quote, like it's more than just that piece. Like I mean, there's just so many layers to unpack there. There's that
Yeah.
layer of gender expectations, like boys don't cry, girls cry. Then there's that
Mhm.
layer of crying means it's a weakness. Then there's the
Yeah.
layer of because crying is a weakness, girls can cry, boys can't cry, so girls are weak,
Yeah.
right? There's so many
Yeah.
layers in that one
There
statement.
are.
So heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking. Okay. So I also did a social media hunt because I was like, I want to look more. And sometimes social media can also be very enlightening and
Yeah,
people share their stories. So I found an Instagram account. Maybe you're familiar with it. It's called Therapy for the Brown Soul.
I
Are
haven't
you
heard that
familiar with
one.
that? This account had really great stuff. So I found a post and the quote says, if you grew up in a home where showing your feelings are not allowed, it makes sense that you may have a hard time opening up and being vulnerable. You may even bottle up emotions and avoid them. This may be why it's hard to be aware of what feelings you are experiencing, right? Which essentially is if you grow up in a home where feelings aren't modeled, like acknowledging and being vulnerability isn't modeled, right? Observing your emotions, validating your emotions, then of course it makes you never learned it, right? Like that's not your normal. That's abnormal to you, even though it should be normal.
Yeah, it's, I just feel like obviously there's nuance and obviously not everybody's the same way, but I feel like it's pretty common in generically speaking South Asian culture to see feelings as like, who cares?
Hmm.
Right? Almost like, oh, you have an emotion? That's cute. Okay, we're moving on.
Yeah.
I don't feel like there's a lot of space for emotions other than
Yeah.
like there's no
There's no
space for anger. And
space.
if there is, it's only allowed for boys and men. And there's no space for like sadness because like, why are you sad? What do you have to be sad about? You have a
Yeah.
house, you have food. There's so much like belittling of
Right.
having feelings and the role that feelings play and how important they are. They're just like completely disregarded. And a part of it is definitely, like cultural trauma and all of that. But there's also a piece, I think, that's more so a survival
Yeah.
piece to it, right? Like there's so many people within the community that feel that they're constantly surviving rather than thriving. And I find that they're the ones who typically feel they feel like they're surviving. They don't
Yeah.
have room for things like emotions. That's too
Right.
frivolous. That's too like
Yeah.
that's a white people thing. Like, what are you talking about emotions? We just
Yeah.
gotta put our head down, gotta get things done. Like, what do you mean?
Right. Right. And
And it's go
I
ahead.
was just saying that I think this is just like definitely intergenerational and maybe back in the day or especially when our parents were immigrating, like even though they were feeling emotions, they didn't make space for it, like you said. Like there's other priorities.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But then it teaches all of this like incorrect beliefs and fear even maybe around like emotions. Like I kid you not, I actually had a client recently who started with me and she lives here in America, obviously she lives in Texas, but she's done like all her schooling in India and then she came here for work and all of that. So like this client in particular, she was really afraid of her emotions that she was having. Like she came for anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
but she was terrified of her anxiety. She was terrified that she lost the ability to be happy go lucky, just like joyous person. She was like, I have all this anxiety now. I'm like, this isn't okay. This isn't normal. I shouldn't have
Yeah.
it. I shouldn't. So much judgment and fear for feeling a
Towards
very normal emotion.
yeah. And I
That's
feel
what I'm
like
talking
that's a
about.
shared experience, right? Like
Yeah.
nobody really talks about normalizes these heavy emotions, like you say,
Yeah.
right? You have to
Yeah.
be happy. And if you're
Yeah.
not, you need to hide it.
Right. But there's a space for it. There's a space for all our emotions. And just because we're feeling our emotions, even the heavy ones, doesn't mean it's the end of the world or there's something wrong with us,
Hmm.
but rather just normalizing the idea that we can feel it and it'll pass. We can feel
Yeah.
it and we can do something with it actively, even
Yeah.
sometimes, right? But there's also this lack of modeling. Like when we go back to the idea of modeling, there's also a lack of modeling of what to do when you feel emotions because emotions aren't even modeled
Hmm.
beyond joy, maybe anger. But that's an important component too. Talking about
Exactly.
how to have a healthy relationship with these emotions. But that's okay, fine. We went through stuff. All right, that's cool. As adults, we can now take that responsibility to figure that out,
Right.
to work with ourselves, understand ourselves better.
Exactly. Okay, well, that was all my research and background. It was a little short and sweet this time around. So we're going to dive into our stories. You ready for mine?
Yes.
Okay. So for me, vulnerability was a struggle. I adopted the idea that showing emotions was a weakness at a very young age. I think this is partly because I was the eldest daughter, and also I shared the eldest daughter complex of always having everything together, being strong. My parents never modeled vulnerability, so I assumed it is just something people do not do. I had the habit of bottling up my emotions and then angry cry or cry in frustration because it was just too much to hold in. I didn't even know vulnerability was a thing until I learned about it in college, which is wild. Yes. I mean, like, can you imagine college me and sitting in psychology class going, what? This is a thing? Yeah, that sounds scary. hmm And clearly, like, and my emotional intelligence in that sense was lacking. Like I feel like I got really good at being a people pleaser, like being in tune of other people's emotions, but when it comes to like my internal work and how I view my own emotions, like that wasn't there. The act of bottling up my emotions became so natural and normal to me that I did it without realizing. During college, when I was in a serious relationship with my now husband, I had many unresolved emotions that I had bottled up for years, and they would manifest through anxiety, jealousy, and anger. My anxiety had built up so much that it had me believe different scenarios that there were no evidence or support for. That's how much it built up. Like my mind was just creating its own story. Um, this journey was mostly personal. I was afraid of being vulnerable with him, with my partner, because I thought he would think of me differently. Like if I had told him what I was thinking or what my brain was trying to piece together, I was afraid that he was going to think about me differently or he would feel differently. And like I was afraid of him rejecting me or abandoning me. Like I didn't want him to like leave me if I told him all about my feelings and struggles. So instead, like,
Because he might see you as like weak.
yeah, or like just like, yeah, like weak or like, yeah. And so instead, my anxiety would show up hidden underneath like weird questions. It was a lot of like trust issues. So like that was like a big thing too. Like I didn't want him to think like, oh, I'm making up these stories in my head about not trusting him when he has no evidence. There's no evidence to support it.
Give young you a little bit of credit here. I know a little bit about your past relationships before your
Yes.
husband now, and I know that you've had very good reason to have some of these trust issues. So I'm
Yes.
going to give your young you a little bit of credit.
Thanks.
It's not coming from
Thanks.
nowhere.
It's not. It's not. And like I grew up in a household where like trust issues was just always there. And I witnessed that too. So like the first man in my life, like, caused trust, like there was just a lot of like examples of mistrust in my life, which led me to feeling anxious, even though my partner at that time, my husband now, didn't give me any reason to feel anxious or distrust. So instead of kind of sharing with him and being open with him and being vulnerable with him, my anxiety was kind of buried, but then it would kind of bubble up or it would be hidden underneath like weird questions I would ask him about his whereabouts. He would provide reassurance, but also point out that the questions were weird. So he was really good about like, hey, like that was a weird question. And that would snap me out of it and be like, oh, yeah, you're right. That was weird.
It's a
And then,
fine line to walk.
yeah,
Well done.
yeah, you did good. And then in the past couple of years, I went through my therapy journey. I've talked about it. And it took a long time, but I was, working towards and I was able to like almost fully resolve these emotions that were bottled up for years and years. I learned to accept my emotions like all in, not just like the happy go lucky emotions, but the heavy ones too, right? Like I realized that this is just part of the human experience. All emotions are part of being a human. So I started practicing vulnerability with him, my partner, by being honest about the emotions. So, like, I started saying something along the lines like, I know this is not true, but I am feeling blank, 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 blank. Like, I would tell him what I'm feeling. And this specifically helped him better understand where I was coming from and provide love and support with no judgment. So as I started taking the risk of being vulnerable and leading and risk of like, oh, like if I'm vulnerable, he might reject me, right? That was like a fear and risk that I was thinking about too. That fear started diminishing because as I was being more honest with him and like saying like, I know this is not true, but these are the thoughts that are going on in my head, he like received that in lots of reassurance, lots of love, no judgment. And that almost in return was like a cycle. Like it almost helped me also not fully like judge myself. Um, yeah. And he never changed the way he loved me, right? Like how much he like how he would treat me. And that was also very reassuring. But instead he supported me. And I feel like my vulnerability actually led us to be closer and help actually model that for him to be more open about his own emotions, because I can see that for him also that's a challenge just because of our culture and how we were raised.
Amazing.
Yeah. So that's my story.
I love it. That's so cool that, even, I mean, obviously Lightman's awesome, but like being able to walk that fine line, being non-judgmental, making you feel reassured, making you feel loved and supported, and calling you out and being like, hey man, that's we're doing that thing again, remember?
Yeah.
That's awesome
Yeah.
to walk that fine line, but
Yeah.
also for you to be able to like receive it.
Yeah.
And feel brave enough to try when you didn't know what was going to
Yeah.
happen. Like that's huge, right? But over time, because he is who he is and he was able to kind of ground you, make you feel comfortable and safe, had like enough data that it was like, okay, yeah, this is fine. I can
Yeah.
do this with him. I'm
Yeah.
safe.
Yeah.
That's a good team effort there.
Yeah, absolutely. And now we're married.
Now you're married. That's the key.
Very
You got to
grateful.
show up, not be judgmental, be
Yes.
loving.
Yes. And it goes both ways for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, you want to hear my story?
Yes, I'm ready.
I kind of broke up my story into little pieces. This is how my brain works. So
Okay.
I want to talk a little bit about kind of what I see as a little bit of a paradox. So growing up, I'm talking about really, really young growing up, like elementary, middle school age. I've talked about this, right? Like I was very emotional. I have no idea how or why. Like this was not modeled to me. There was nobody in my immediate family who is especially like emotional or like comfortable with any other emotions other than like joy and anger. I have no idea where or how or why I had the confidence to truly be emotional, but I was very emotional. I was very, well, they saw it as too sensitive, but whatever. I was emotional. I was vulnerable, is what I'm going to spin it as. I was authentic. Obviously, you go into elementary school is great. Everybody's like buddy, it's cool. But middle school, I mean, we talked about it, right? I would not go back to middle school. Middle school was a nightmare.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would.
No, that's like
awkward
raging
years.
hormonal teenagers.
Yes.
No, thank you.
No, thank you.
No, thank you. But in middle school, like I went into middle school still with this like very quote unquote too sensitive, vulnerable headspace and all that, heart on sleeve kind of a person, right? So I had friends with that same approach, right? I came at them from this very heart on my sleeve type approach. And like that was fine with some of them, they received that well, they were loving. But I wasn't very discriminatory with friends. Like I wasn't like, this person resonates, this person doesn't. But oh well, I attracted people who would treat me like a doormat. You know this. And so what that meant was I assumed there were no games, there was no like agenda or motives with other people. I didn't do all of that. But what I attracted meant I got burned a few times, obviously. Right? A few times I say, but like a lot of times. We'll just leave it at that. I'm not talking about the number. But essentially, I was vulnerable. That's when I felt like I was truly, truly, absolutely 1,000% me, vulnerable, just authentic. And in middle school, mean bullies of hormonal teenagers would be obviously thinking about friendships, social hierarchy, climbing social ladders, like whatever, hormonal teenagers' motivations are, whatever it was. So I felt like there were certain parts of me that I didn't really care, like that's just me, but that were like maybe ridiculed or like, kind of joked about, or like if I shared something, I don't know, maybe things about like family or like just something like sensitive, maybe like innermost feelings kind of things. These people did not keep that trust. They would just kind of unauthorized go talk about it with other people.
Share your story
So
or share your
yeah,
information.
without my permission. No
No,
permission.
no.
Exactly. Or and sometimes it was harmless, like, okay, like it's fine, it's not a big deal. But sometimes it's like almost like used against me in a way, like to actively ridicule, middle school, man, whatever. But I also say that this is kind of like a paradox because I've been a people pleaser throughout my entire life. You know this, obviously. But by definition, technically, people pleasers aren't being vulnerable, right? Because they're not being authentic. They're just kind of pleasing and molding themselves into what you need. So that's why I say it's like kind of like a spectrum, kind of like a paradox. I was both vulnerable and a people pleaser. It called on the situation, but usually with like friends and everything, I feel like I was more authentic. With family, like especially like not immediate family, I was more of a people pleaser. But in high school and college, past middle school, the dreadful stage, I feel like things got a little bit better, a smidge better. Like I still felt like I was more or less kind of coming at it with the same pace, maybe a little bit pulled back. I started kind of being more cautious, but I was just like tired also. I was just so tired of having to do this and being burned and like being taken advantage of. And so I feel like that kind of triggered at some point throughout this whole high school, college time. It kind of flipped. And so I was less vulnerable. I was more like the mask on faker version of me. I went even more into people pleasing than the vulnerability. Yeah. So even more on that side. And like, I think there were definitely a handful of people, maybe one handful of people that I felt I could be genuinely vulnerable with. But like with everybody else, I felt like this persona I embodied. Yeah.
Yeah. Or like
really
they
bubbly.
Make you feel like they're judging you or.
Yeah, exactly. So I kind of people pleased my way into being the person that I thought I needed to be, or I thought I should be, quote unquote, right? I was very bubbly. I was very outgoing. And like that wasn't completely inauthentic to who I was, but there were just pieces of me that I like performed, I guess. Or it felt that way now, looking back on it.
I mean, that's a good word, perform. People pleasers are performers.
Kind of.
Actors.
To some
Not
degree.
like fully, but like subconsciously.
Yeah.
Right? Like
it feels that way sometimes at least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like you have to sometimes, when you're pleasing someone else and you have a heavy emotion you're feeling, you don't want to burden that other person. So you're going to act like you're fine.
Yeah. Lock it down. Perform your heart out. You're joyous. You're good to go.
Yeah. Even if that's not what you're feeling.
Even if that, exactly. And then, post-college, post-grad life, essentially, I feel like things started going more and more back to healthy and normal.
Yeah.
I think post-graduate life is when I started feeling like truly more comfortable with my authentic self. I mean, technically as a kid, like there is that, but even more so than a kid, because I didn't just have like the innocence of the past, but like genuinely feeling like, okay, I've gone through all of it and I can still embody myself in this. It feels a bit more pure than actually when you're younger. I don't know, to me.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I feel like I've been embodying that in like different ways. Like obviously with our podcast, I mean, we're literally talking about vulnerability on this podcast.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, in every episode, we have like a little share our own personal stories and like we're sharing to, I don't even know who's listening. I don't know from where they're listening. Right. So this is very much an avenue to practice our vulnerability.
It's an act of vulnerability, what we're doing. We're putting our life on blast.
I know. Exactly. To be judged. Hopefully well, but I don't know.
Yes. But also normalizing. One step at a time.
Like this is fine. This is okay. And like even right now, being able to call it out and say like, this is a hard thing. It's not necessarily easy, or it doesn't come without any thought of like, oh, it can be vulnerable. Sure, no problem. Like there's a little bit that's like, oh, I wonder how this story is going to feel for people to hear and to receive. Oh, I wonder if this is going to resonate. Oh, I wonder if this is going to like click at all with people, or if they're going to be like, that's weird. You know, like you never know who's listening and how they're going to receive it, but it's a choice to be vulnerable, to say,
it is a choice.
I'm comfortable. It doesn't matter how other people perceive this. This is my story. This is who I am.
It's my truth.
Yeah. It's an active choice for that.
Exactly.
And I feel like more recently, I mean, right? Like I've relaunched my Instagram page, Try with the New Show, with more reels lately and being really consistent with it. I'm proud of myself. But it took me a long time to get to that place. I mean, I've been thinking about, I started that page back when we were early COVID days, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's been on and off for me because I felt like that was so vulnerable getting my thoughts out there.
Mm-hmm.
Never showed my face, but now all I do is show my face, especially.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a really, really vulnerable thing for me. And I feel like I put it off for so long. But post grad life, I'm feeling good about being authentic. I'm feeling good about
Yeah.
preaching, doing what I preach essentially to my clients. So I feel like, you know what, I
Right.
can show up. This is fine.
Yes.
So it was a struggle, but you know what? We got there. I
How do
did
you
it.
feel
I'm proud
about
of
it
myself.
now that you're all out there on your page?
Really, really surprising, but I love it. When I do
Yay.
these like little acting reels, I thought I would feel so embarrassed and like so
Yeah.
shameful and like so weird, but I actually kind of love it.
You're good. You do a good job. You're
Well,
good.
thank you.
And you
I kind
share
of
very
love
helpful
filming myself and
information.
sharing it like that.
I love it. You're so
Yeah.
cute.
It totally surprised me. I was literally taken aback when one day I realized I was looking forward to it and I was like, whoa, what?
I know we surprise ourselves.
I know. It's funny the things that we're capable of when we get out of our own heads.
Yeah. Right. Right.
And then I feel like more of like a personal, non-work related stuff. I feel like in relationships,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like instead of being angry or like passive aggressive because I didn't feel like I could be vulnerable because I felt like it wouldn't be accepted, the
Mm-hmm.
vulnerable piece that I wanted to share because I felt like, again, right, the people pleasers play. I felt like I wouldn't be liked or
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't have these friends. I wouldn't have these relationships. Again, the same thing.
Yeah.
I didn't feel comfortable. So I would kind of swallow my truth, like you said, right? And so
Yeah.
you do it enough and then the anger boils and then the anger boils until the anger just has nowhere to go but out. And that can come out as like passive aggression or that can come out as like just anger, burning bridges down.
Yeah.
That's not cool. That's definitely not
Yeah.
cool. But working through it, like you said too, like me working through it in my therapy, me working through it and just kind of coming to this place of like, this is normal, this is okay, this is necessary to have a good relationship, and the right people will stick. The people that aren't right won't stick. That
Yeah.
kind of belief, letting that actually be like sink in and like actually feel it was really helpful to kind of be vulnerable with people. And now I feel like I really just don't care most of the time. I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
new people. I'm still an introvert. Okay. I don't like meeting new people like without having like a moment to kind of prep myself and like,
Yeah.
prepare for it mentally. But when I'm there, I don't have the same thing that I used to have in the past where I'd be like, oh, like how should I present myself? And like what part of me should I be? And like I'm just like, this is who I am. If they're gonna be
Yeah.
good friends, I gotta be who I am. I gotta figure out if they're like gonna be a good friend or not.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
There's a lot. I feel like as the older we get, all vulnerability becomes more precious.
Yeah.
Like who do we want to choose? Like
Yeah.
we are comfortable with being vulnerable, but we're choosing wisely on who we trust our vulnerability with.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like as a therapist, what I've found is obviously I deal with vulnerability every single day. My clients are vulnerable when they come to therapy
Yeah.
every single day, right? So, what I've found really reflecting on the idea of vulnerability is that without this vulnerability, I truly believe that we just cannot fully understand ourselves. We cannot heal our emotional wounds. We cannot create meaningful relationships and connections. And we cannot really truly know or meet our wants and needs. And we cannot be authentic.
Right.
It's like so vital to all of these things of knowing ourselves, of finding happiness, of finding peace, of all the things that typically people go to therapy for. Without that vulnerability, you can't have any of that.
Yeah. I think even like the first step of joining therapy or seeking out therapy or doing your
That's
first
vulnerable.
therapy session, that's this big step.
That's
Sometimes
vulnerable.
taking that first step is so hard for a lot of people, including myself.
Oh yeah.
Accepting like, okay, yeah, I am feeling these emotions and I do want to seek professional support.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I feel like that was my reflection as I was thinking about it. There were times when I was, there was times when I wasn't. But my conclusion is it's important and we need to have it
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
practice it.
I think it's like that quote, right? Like your armor that hides the vulnerability also masks like the fear and insecurity. Like insecurity and fears, those are also just normal, right? So it's really important to think about that, is that our society as a whole, just not even the South Asian culture, has painted this picture that insecurities and fears are abnormal too, but they're not. You know, you must, on social media have everything together, not show any of those heavy emotions, right? That's only in the movies or like, in your personal lives, not like normalized. But, it was really interesting when you talked about like anger as like a form of expression when it's like hard to be vulnerable. And I feel like that's something that we shared in common, where like for me too, like anger was like the first emotion that kind of bursted out when I was bottling up my emotions. And that's, I like almost, I'm trying to think back to those instances that I felt that heavy emotion of anger just because I've bottled up so much. And all I want to do is angry cry or frustration cry, anger cry, frustration cry. And it's interesting how is that emotion is the one that, like it's almost as if like our brains and our bodies are angry at ourselves, like that you bottled all this up. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I love talking about anger because I feel like, I don't know about you, but I was always ashamed when I felt angry.
Yeah, me too.
Like we said earlier, right? Like anger is an acceptable emotion when guys have it, not when girls have it.
Yeah.
But even then, it's like, oh, you're angry. Why are you angry? But like, it's more acceptable for guys and girls to have anger.
Yeah.
And it's just so like so liberating to accept that anger is so freaking necessary because anger, like I tell my clients this all the time, anger is your protector. It is literally always thinking about protecting you. So if anger is coming up, like don't judge it, don't be mad at it. It's coming up because it realizes you need protection. It's your bodyguard, it's your bouncer.
Yeah.
So just try to understand, why is it coming up? It's probably because it feels like you're not being treated well.
Exactly.
At least for me, that's exactly why it's always happened. For my clients, that's exactly why it happens. It's when we don't get treated well, when our anger is saying, you deserve better. What's going on? You need to speak up.
I like that.
Yeah.
Makes sense. I've never like thought about anger as like a protective factor.
It's very self-protective.
It's a good perspective.
It's literally our bodyguard.
Yeah. I love it.
I like to call it the justice warrior.
Yeah. Justice warrior. I'm like always, when I hear the word anger, I just think of the Inside Out character. The little fireball head.
I love Inside Out. It's so great.
But like I do resonate with your story of like growing up, vulnerability. Like for me, like I adopted the idea like of being fully vulnerable, but I do resonate with you when you said like there were people that kind of took advantage, like people that you trusted your vulnerability with, they took advantage of that. And it's like I really like, I'm curious to like what was the reason, like why was our vulnerability something that other people wanted to take advantage of? Like what is it about vulnerability itself, and what is it about the other person that wants to take, like that uses that as a, not a weapon, but like a tool to get what they want or get what their motive is?
I mean, I wouldn't
like their
go
insecurity too.
Yes, 100%, 1,000%. That's what it is. It's the same thing. Like I was going to connect it to like bullying, right? Like when bullies bully, there's a modeled behavior of bullying them. Like they feel bullied by like probably parents or like somebody in their life, their older siblings or somebody. And so they see this as an acceptable form to make them feel powerful. So why do they bully? Because they want to be powerful, right? It comes from their pain, their insecurity. They see something and they're like, that makes me feel inferior. I got to do something about it. And so it's, I mean, technically, truly though, this is a very therapist speaking, it's their protective mechanism. It's an unhealthy one, but it's a protective mechanism. It's saying, I feel small, I need to feel big, I'm going to make fun of you. I'm going to spread rumors about you. I'm going to bully you because that makes me feel powerful. Sucks.
Yeah.
And it's when people aren't raised with that emotional intelligence and that emotional awareness. We do what we can do to protect ourselves like that.
Right. Wow, that's powerful and heavy.
And we're going to end on this note. It's heavy. Okay, we're done. Did our job. That's so funny. That reminds me, when I was a baby therapist, like when I was just starting out, I used to say this, and I would say it to some of my clients and they would laugh and it would lighten the mood. But I used to say this all the time. I used to say, if I make my client cry, I've done my job.
And my
Because
therapist has said
obviously
that.
I was getting clients who had a lot of like heavy emotions. And so normalizing like, okay, cry it out, feel it. We got to do that.
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
saw that as like a personal little success. And I would tell them that and they
Yeah.
would just like laugh. They'd be like, oh my God.
It's so funny.
So that this
It's
is
an
my new
expression. It is an expression. Crying is a healthy expression.
It is. It's
It is.
cathartic. I mean, have you
Mhm.
never had like that after a good cry and you're like, that felt good. I
Yeah.
needed
That feels good.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. So this is a good thing, guys. I'm gonna leave you on a heavy note for you to breathe through it. You're
Yes.
fine.
Yes. Yes.
But really, shall I wrap up?
Yeah. We got vulnerable. We're all
We
done.
got I'm gonna leave it. That's good. Okay, here we go. Wrapping it up. As always, if our podcast has resonated with you, our lovely listeners, and you'd like to share your story, ask us any questions, you can reach out to us at talksalvationtome@gmail.com, or you can find us on any and all the socials at our handle at talksalvationtome. Catch you next
Okay.
time.